So here in the northeastern Stormberg, these are just examples. Obviously, this happens in all three of these adjacent mountainscapes where you get complex accumulations of paintings, superpositions and weathering, which makes recording a lot more challenging. So as I said, I'm really focusing on method today, and investigations about method are underrepresented in rock art archaeology. This is something we're not talking about enough, and well done to this conference for doing so. Few of us discuss our methods and the reasons for the recording practices that we use, and there seems to be an assumption that this changes according to the question. And this is something I want to leave with you to think about. Why are we changing our practice according to a question, whether it's in management, conservation, or in research? So quantifying paintings is part of method and the recording process, although few South African researchers are using it currently. I know Gilrain and Dukiyake, Lily, and obviously the brilliant work Nick is doing are a few of the exceptions. And it has largely been rejected because of these notions of naïve. And this is based out of the research that came from in the 1970s and 80s. And the problems was an assumption of objectivity. So when we talk about science, there was this belief that we need to be objective. Well, it's 50 years down the line, and we know that we have mitigated objectivity, but this kind of notion of a pure science has been discarded. We also know that one painting is as significant as 100, but numbers always count. And we know this from the Maloti-Drakensberg Transfrontier Park that is now a UNESCO site. And this amazing presentations we've had this morning, constant reminder of how important these numbers are. In addition, we have to be very, very aware of the categories and typologies, and I don't think this is peculiar to science. I think whatever sector you're working in, everyone is stepping back and saying, what are the labels we're using and how apt they are? And I'm with Julian on this, that we need to use more broader categories, but we'll get there. So what is quantitative methods? Well, simply it involves counting, recording the numbers of specific paintings or engravings. And I do focus on paintings today, but please include engravings with the comments that I'm making and their details. So this is not about how many humans you find, it includes how are the humans dressed, what are they carrying, what are they holding, what are their relationships with other paintings. And with new applications such as D-Stretch, so D-Stretch you can download onto your cell phone. It uses different color filters, as you saw in Nick's presentation, that you can actually see things that normally you can't see with a naked eye. And quantification occurs in two ways. During surveys, you saw with the work that ECRAG is doing, where you take a specific section of an area and you walk that area flat, surveying, going to every single rock shelter and boulder to see if there are paintings. The downside of this approach is often there's not a lot of time. So the recording you are doing is not in the same detail as when you are for research management or conservation purposes. And that is really, I think, the biggest difference is that when you start going into research questions, your kind of detailing is enormous. And I use a longhand approach. For my PhD, I ended up with about 477 categories because I use the paintings to guide my recording. Something came out very strongly on Monday, and I cannot stress this enough, is that we cannot separate theory from materialities, because the way you think is going to be the way you do. And we have to be very aware of what I call the material discursive, but it's this entanglement of theory and the material. And I argue that our critical material context has to be based on the ontologies of the people who made the records. And this must be emphasized. The methods that we are using should be connected to these contextual ontologies. In my case, it's forager ontologies, where human and more than human persons were involved in relationship making practices. So we recognize more than humans, earth, water, plant, animals, celestials, all have the potential for personhood. And when we think of these relationship making practices, we need to step back a little bit and realize that research, and I'm going to emphasize this, I include management conservation in research, is actually a web-like process. So complicated Alison Wiley's notion of cables and tacking, we're actually working in this relational web where nodes in this web are going to become distinct. And quantitative method is fantastic for understanding that, because it forces us, as you saw with our presentations this morning, it forces us to think about what are the decisions we're making when we record? How are we deciding on this category? And the same thing for the paintings. We're looking at the painting, all aspects of the painting and the relationships, and it is slow and careful. Quantitative recording involves both the micro and the macro. So we are zooming right in on a specific painting, and I include smears, splotches, flecks, dots. That is all part of rock paintings, and we can extend that to engraved surfaces too. So it's looking at a painting in all of its detail, and then what are the relationships with other paintings. So we look at pigments, rock, sites, mountainscapes. We can start understanding these entanglements and what I argue is the personhood of the rock and mountainscapes. Paintings and engraving should always be used to guide the categories. I think it's very difficult to formulate a very long list and checkbox, because from my experience, often paintings don't really fit those boxes. So we need to keep initially our category simple. But these numbers produce patterns. And this is something that excites every archaeologist. This is what we're looking at. Even in anthropology, it's patterns, right? And that's what we want to investigate. And this is where quantitative research is also so exciting. And previous research, at David Lewis-Williams' 90th birthday celebration, he said no one uses this research. And he's wrong. We use this research all the time. Anytime anyone talks about paintings of Eden, that is based on the numerical research that has been done. Leah's fantastic work using Nick Walker's records, and how amazing for these people who were very particular. And we had to get away from this obsession about accuracy, because in my work, and I look at the ratios are different from the older work that didn't have applications such as D-stretch, but gosh, they still remain relevant. And I'm going to give you examples with this. The other exciting thing about having previous quantitative research is testing sampling methods. And that's a huge issue when we start talking about using statistics, right? So in my master's research, I use a random sampling method. In my PhD research, I used a selective sampling method. And it's been so fantastic to have Vinnicombe's records, Lewis-Williams records, and that of mine to do these comparisons, to see how sampling actually affects our results. And then when the results are similar, what amazing, we've got an independent supporting strand of evidence. When they're not similar, we've got an equally important independent constraining device. And this is what archaeological scientific reasoning is, right? It's not just this is good, it's also this is as far as we can argue with the evidence that we have. This is just one table that I've used in my PhD research where I've tested my results against those of previous results, looking at ratios in the numbers of paintings of eland compared to redbuck. They are the two most commonly depicted antelope that are found through each of these mountainscapes. And what's very interesting, in the northeastern Stormberg, the ratio between paintings of eland to paintings of redbuck are smallest, followed by the central Maloti-Drakensberg, and then lastly, the southern Maloti-Drakensberg, which has the highest number of paintings of eland compared to redbuck. And when we start thinking about animals as persons and relationships, we can start asking questions of why. What was happening in the relationships between people and these antelope species? And it's also been fantastic for me looking in paintings of conflations. I don't like using the word therianthrope because it privileges the human, and it also is inclined to make us not see other categories, such as these animal-animal conflations. These are very broad categories, but this is what my quantified research has shown. And zooming in on these animal-animal conflations, it's been very interesting that the most conflated species is antelope. And this is based on my own work, but also on the research of others. So I come back to this importance. We need to quantify my research. And obviously, this is something that I've answered in my PhD research. Categories, typologies must be based on the people's ontologies that we are researching. They should also be based on previous research in an area. What is painted, what is found there. Educate yourself if you've never been to the area. They are always open to interpretation. So don't fool yourself that you are being objective. When we say this is an eland, that is an interpretation. When we say this is human, this is male or female, that is an interpretation. So we need to keep these categories simple. And our recording strategies must be always open to the things that don't fit. It's a very tiring thing to do. Don't be tempted to put a very weird looking stick-like object into a stick category, because that has not been true to the image. I think using a quantitative approach is good scientific practice. We're moving away from objectivity, but I think it's very important to support your research with numbers. I don't like having to take your word for it, however much you experience that you have. And I think replicability is very important in good scientific practice. It's not about flattening. On the contrary, I think using quantitative research is actually about enlivening our understandings of past people's lived experience. It's about slowly and carefully assessing relationships. And it's about the small, subtle differentiations. We all make this mistake of wanting these da-da, and actually the da-da is actually in the small things. I would love to see more collaboration, love to see more conversations about what methods we're using, who's using a quantified approach, what are the problems, what are the things that you found very difficult. I think when we start dating, and dating colored pigments is going to be around the corner. We're looking in the next 8 years. These quantified numbers are going to be really, really important for the kind of questions we're going to be asking. Or recording. Quantified recording is important for research, management, and conservation. And especially when we start thinking of the slow science movement and be sensitive to intersectional practice. Thank you so much to the conference organizers. This conference has been amazing. To see everyone feel so safe to ask questions that don't always agree with perhaps an official institutional line, and the fact that the decision makers are happy to be challenged. I'm very grateful, and I feel very privileged to meet so many of my colleagues from around Southern Africa and Madagascar. Wow, amazing. I have had incredible funding. My supervisors are fantastic, and especially I give thanks to my local mountain communities who support my research and share their knowledge freely. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Dawn. Just one comment before taking questions. For you, Lelia, and other people as well. There's a point you just made about making sure that our categories fit the ontologies of our study.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important for the quantitative research that we're doing, that it's not just the numbers, but the numbers are meaningful in the framework of the ontologies of people I'm studying. I think that's an important thing to remember.
Can I just make a very quick point that I forgot to make in my presentation? So we've been seeing lots of fancy equipment used in some of the presentations here. And I want to emphasize all you need is an excellent cell phone, a notebook, a pen, and a ruler. Right.
Okay, questions?
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. For the longest time, I've been worried about local people not really doing a lot of quantitative analysis, running stats with their data, but for the last few years, I've seen that coming through, and I think it's a really exciting thing. It's also good that you warn us that numbers on themselves don't mean anything. You need to use numbers for specific significant reasons, for specific purposes. Whether it's to manage the site, you don't just punch numbers, and that part I like. Also the idea that we need to deal with theory, we need to deal with data. The way to understand this site sometimes is to take a step back and take a theoretical approach to it, and that way we can probably manage these sites better. Yeah, some ways to do all this to train from us about, but I really enjoy that approach. Just the reasons. I'll say at some time, I told you to help out with that. Let's bring you to also what to do about that's the whole.
Thank you.
Yeah, Don, I'm always subjective, and I'm happy to be subjective. I never try to be objective, and never will I. And this is why I always write in my first person.
We know that.
This is why I always write in my publications in first person, because this is me. You know, take it or leave it. If you have a critical opinion, go and write a response article. But on a serious note, I'm glad you are, enlarging the small number of people who want to highlight the significance of quantitative analysis. Because the first generation of the Davids in Rockart, Northern Africa, once argued that numbers do not lie. Before he changed his tune, as he said, he once argued that numbers do not. But I still think that even when he was pushing for an ethnographic approach, he was using numbers to suit his argument whenever it was possible. I'll give you an example. When he argues about the significance of elect in Southern African rock art, not even in the locations where he was working, generalizing throughout the whole of Southern Africa, which I have a problem with, he was using statistics, to say they are the most painted. You can't say most without quantification. Equally, when he was arguing against the hunting magic as an interpretation according to rock art in the earlier days, he argued that there are very few hunting scenes, and therefore it cannot be part of hunting magic. That's quantification, that is disguised from an anthropological point of view. You also make a comment about categories. I am of the view, you said you've got over 400 categories. I was like, wow, would I still be able to make sense of what I'm doing if I have so many categories? So you have a much deeper mind than myself. But my argument is always, any category must be informed by a specific research project. I don't have to subscribe to your category if the questions I'm asking to the rock art of the same site you're working at are different. So I must look at my research questions and focus on categories as I will advise. There can't be a generalistic approach where we say this is the set of categories that every other researcher in every other project, in every other locality in South Africa must conform to. Lastly, I just want to on this statement. One of my troubles with Southern African rock art studies, and I'm generalizing here, is that we have become prisoners of our previous findings. And when I say prisoners of our previous findings, I'm talking, everybody, even your amateur archaeologists who were interpreting rock art in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I feel like we are trying very hard to look for complexity so that we are not accused of being undermining, to the rock art authors. If you consider how inserted, they used to be in the late 1800s, 1890s. So even some of the most simplistic, I will argue, panels, we want to find the most complex, the most difficult interpretation to give, because I think we just don't want to come across as being simplistic, that is undermining, of those work that they had. What is your comment on us being, as I argue, prisoners of ethical standards?
Okay, I need to clarify categories. My multiple categories, I have 27 main categories, and that is human, animal, antelope, specific species, dots, flecks, dashes, and so forth. Then under each category, I detail it again. So I recorded every single detail. So we come to actions, what is each person doing, what they're wearing, what their clothes, what their decoration is. But to start with, the categories are very simple. It is not an endless splintering into arbitrary things. So you can actually see then the patterning that is coming out in those things. I absolutely agree with you, and this is a point I want to make to everyone about Nick's recording app. Obviously, what I need for Maloti-Drakensberg and Stormberg is very different to what they need in the Western Cape. So he is adjusting the app to suit my needs. So it's not forcing the same things into the same categories. And I think it is important to, it is important to have certain categories that are the same and not an eland is an eland. But keep it simple like that, as Julian mentioned earlier. And then as far as simplifying things, I think you need to distinguish there are lots of research approaches to rock art. And I think all of them are giving an important contribution, whether we agree with them or not, because they make a step back, they make us think about things, and I think this is very, very important. I don't think people try to deliberately complicate things. I don't agree with that, because I think people are thinking very, very carefully about relationships and what we can experience. So there's a shift between, I think a really good analogy is thinking about rock art, changing your thinking about rock art from nouns to verbs.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about for a while and thought up quite a few of these things. Just wanted to say, so for me, you know, you obviously whoever's doing it is making their own decisions in their own categories, but especially when you're wanting to compare with other areas, you also have to rely on what people have gone before, which is a kind of constraint.
Yeah.
And then another thing I just wanted to say, which I think by looking at this and trying to count and trying to see, it actually forces you to look at the art very closely and see other things. You know, often people will go in, take photos, think, oh, look at the photos back, and you can't make out things. But if you're in that shelter and you have to see how many figures are here, is that actually a figure? And as you say, with de-stretch. So sorry, just more of a comment, but thank you.
Thanks, Gilroy. And keep up your quantified research.